The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East for his fifth visit since Israel began its war on Gaza. His previous trips didn't bring any respite for Palestinians under bombardment. So what's the purpose of this visit? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East as Israel's war on Gaza rages on. Nearly 23,000 Palestinians have been killed and tens of thousands injured since early October. Many of the weapons used to kill them and flatten much of Gaza were supplied by the United States. Just over a week ago, as Blinken was preparing for this trip, he approved an emergency measure bypassing Congress to supply more tank shells to Israel. The State Department says that among the aims of Blinken's trip is in part to help civilians, stem violence and reduce regional tension. But how will he achieve that? Or is this visit more about PR than reality? We'll explore those issues with our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
The top U.S. diplomat has traveled to the Middle East 5 times in 3 months. Antony Blinken's latest tour comes as fears rise that Israel's war on Gaza could ignite a wider regional conflict.
A big part of the conversations we'll be having over the coming days with all of our allies and partners is looking at the steps that they can take, using the influence and ties that they have to do just that, to make sure that this conflict doesn't spread.
Despite the huge death toll in Gaza, the U.S. has continued to be Israel's biggest backer, providing billions of dollars worth of military aid and weapons, and vetoing a UN resolution for an immediate ceasefire. Critics say Washington has not changed the intensity of Israel's attacks.
This administration has put forward no red lines, no ultimatums. There's been no conditioning of aid, none of that. So I do think that this chaotic situation in the region, which can always get further out of control, has a lot to do with the policies of the Biden administration.
Negotiations to secure the release of Israeli captives is on Blinken's agenda. Also on the list, he says, are finding ways to deliver more food, fuel, and medicine into Gaza. With more than 2 million Palestinians displaced, it's not clear what difference Blinken's visit will make.
People stand in line and go around looking for a way to find water for their children. We have so many problems. In the camp, there is no water, no service, no medical attention or hygiene.
Tensions between Washington and Tehran are also unfolding in the Red Sea. Iran-backed Houthi rebels have attacked commercial vessels for weeks, a way, they say, to pressure Israel to stop its war on Gaza. And now, 3 months into Israel's bombing of the Strip, Blinken's visit will test the power of diplomacy. And it may also give more insight into the extent the U.S. is prepared to go in backing Israel. Katia Lopez-Hodayan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, on the day of Blinken's visit to Qatar, home of the Al Jazeera network, Israel targeted and killed Hafsa al-Dahdu, the surviving son of Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Gaza, Wael al-Dahdu, who'd already lost most of his family members in an Israeli strike back in October. Hamza's targeted killing brought a strong response from Qatar's Minister of State for International Cooperation, Lolwa Rashid al-Khatta, who condemned, quote, the brutal occupation machine and everyone who contributed and agreed. All right, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Reston in Virginia, we're joined by Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From Dubai, Hafsa Halawa, an independent consultant who works on political, social and economic affairs across the Middle East, North Africa and the Horn of Africa. And in Washington, D.C., Gawdat Bahgat, Professor of National Security Affairs at the National Defense University's Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Study. A warm welcome to you all. Before we talk about Antony Blinken's visit to the region, I just want to take a moment to address the targeted killing of Hafsa Dahdu, son of our Gaza bureau chief, Wael Daftou, on the very day that Blinken arrives in Qatar. Now, previous visits by Blinken have coincided with major Israeli actions against Palestinians. Back in October, more than 1 million Palestinians were ordered to leave northern Gaza while Blinken was in Israel. An explosion along one of the so-called safe routes killed 70 people. A few days later, on October 17th, Israeli attacks on the Al-Aqli Baptist Hospital killed 471 people. During yet another Blinken visit in November, Israel targeted a UN-run school in the Jabalia refugee camp. At least 15 people were killed, dozens more were injured. At the end of the brief ceasefire in December, Israel resumed its attacks. Its forces increased their strikes in the southern Gaza Strip a day after Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Israel to do more to protect civilians. And now, during Blinken's latest visit, the son of our Gaza bureau chief, Hafsa Halawa, has been killed by an Israeli airstrike in southern Gaza. Trita, are the Israelis trying to send some sort of message here, do you think? Or this can't be just coincidence, can it?
It certainly doesn't come across as a coincidence, and it's very clear that the number of journalists killed in this conflict far exceeds that of any other recent conflict, more than 100 so far. And I think it's also affected the reporting coming out of Gaza in the sense that we're seeing less images, less reporting, precisely because those who can report have been silenced. Given the fact that the Israelis are resisting even the very limited pressure that Biden is putting on them in regards to how to handle the war in Gaza, it wouldn't be surprising as this is one of their efforts to up the ante right before Blinken arrives in the region in order to signal how much they will resist any effort by the Biden administration that doesn't come with clear pressure, such as putting the aid to Israel to make it contingent upon them living up to certain standards. As long as there's no real pressure, it seems that the Israelis will continue to behave in this way.
We'll discuss, we'll come to pressure and what pressure can be applied to the Israelis in just a few moments. But first, Hafsa, Blinken says that he'll be looking at what can be done to maximize the protection of civilians in Gaza and increase deliveries of humanitarian assistance. But with more than 22,000 dead now, many of them women and children, does that ring hollow to you? It's too little too late, isn't it?
Well, I think it's not just too little too late, Adrian, and thank you very much for having me. I think it's also completely false. Nothing in the US's real policy actions beyond certain doublespeak that we see or tweets that are written by the teams of everybody from the Secretary of State to the President of the United States and other members of the government seems to signal that there is any material pressure on Israel, not just to protect civilians or to prevent this level of civilian death, but also, in fact, to bring this war to any kind of conclusion or to halt the current hostilities that we see in Gaza or in the West Bank or in occupied East Jerusalem. At the end of the day, nothing that we've seen since October 7th from anyone in this administration signals that the US is anything but supportive of this war. And really, the red lines seem to hinge on how much they're willing to back the expansion of this conflict by Israel.
Professor Bahgat, just a week ago, as we were hearing, Blinken approved the sale to Israel of 155mm artillery shells and related equipment, determining that the emergency required the immediate sale to Israel, thereby waiving congressional review requirements. And yet here he is in the region, supposedly to talk peace. I mean, this visit reeks of hypocrisy, doesn't it?
United States has very consistent policy to stop the war, and it is important to point out that Israel does not listen all the time to United States, and in American media lately they highlighted some kind of disagreement between Biden administration and the government of Netanyahu. And I believe also it is important to understand there is difference between private diplomacy and public diplomacy. United States government, it will not help to go in front of camera and condemn Israel But my understanding, senior American officials, when they meet with their Israeli counterparts, they push as hard as they can to use smart weapons to minimize the killing of innocent people, because escalation is against the U.S. national interest.
Trita, what do you make of that? Does the US have any sway over the Israeli government, any leverage at all, given what we were hearing there from the professor, when he said that Israel just isn't listening to the US? To what extent is the current situation directly the fault of the Biden administration's policy? How much of the blame for the current suffering in Gaza does the US have to bear?
Well, the Israelis are not listening because they don't have to listen, because the United States is not making them listen. The idea that the United States is much tougher in private may be true, but it's not tough enough because we're not seeing any effect of it. Reality is the United States has a tremendous amount of leverage. It is choosing not to use it. The United States has shipped 10,000 tons of weapons and ammunition to Israel since the beginning of this war. According to an Israeli major general in an interview last month, he made it very clear, if the United States were to halt the flow of weapons and ammunition to Israel, Israel would not be able to continue this fight. It's very clear that the United States has leverage, but choosing not to use it. And that raises the question that you just asked, to what extent is then the United States also responsible for the killings that are taking place right now? And I think the Biden administration is somewhat nervous, as they should be, about the complaint of the South African government accusing Israel of genocide and taking this to the International Court of Justice. If Israel is found to be guilty of genocide, it will have implications for the United States as well, mindful of its extensive aid to Israel during this period.
Why, Trita, is the US not pressuring Israel when it's not happy with what's going on?
Well, I'm not so sure that it's not happy, because reality is that the earlier impression that the Biden administration was trying to stop this but didn't have leverage, I don't think has been proven to be compatible with reality. Biden signed on to the Israeli military objective of eliminating Hamas. He wanted Israel to do to Hamas what the United States could not do to the Taliban. Because of that, he has stood in the way of any ceasefire, any attempt to bring the war to an end, short of first having eliminated Hamas. And that's why I think we have to accept that the United States is actually in support of this policy. It is not trying to stop this.
Hafsa, I know you want to come in. Let me just throw it back to Professor Bahgat, though. You wanted to say something there.
Thank you. There is no doubt that United States has a lot of leverage. U.S. foreign aid to Israel is huge, but also it is important not to underestimate Israel as sovereign country. And Israel is one of the richest countries in the world, and one of the strongest military power in the Middle East and in the world. Israel does not take orders from United States. And basically, United States, like any country, does what it believes is in its best interest. And escalation in the Middle East, killing innocent people, this is bad for the United States. And I have no doubt that the United States wants to end the war to minimize the killing of innocent people. And there are many disagreements between US and Israel, one of them about eliminating Hamas. The United States does not believe that Hamas can be eliminated. Hamas is part of the Palestinian civil society. Hamas is a political military movement, and the United States, in my mind, understands that Israeli goals cannot be achieved.
Hafsa, I know you wanted to come in there, but I'll ask you another question as well. Blinken urged Middle Eastern countries to use their influence over regional actors to ensure that the conflict is contained in order to prevent, quote, an endless cycle of violence. But why? Why put the onus on allies in the region when, as we were discussing, it's the US that holds the key here? If it called for a ceasefire, put pressure on Israel and stop using its veto at the Security Council and also stopped supplying Israel with weapons, the violence would end more or less immediately, wouldn't it?
I agree. And I think fundamentally to sort of go back, and I actually agree completely with Trita, but I also agree with Professor Bahgat that ultimately this is a US administration that over the last 3 years has fundamentally misunderstood all the regional players, actors and countries in the Middle East, North Africa, misunderstood national security goals, targets, misunderstood the relationships between each other and the targeted relationships with the United States. And by extension, what Blinken has been doing on this trip, will do on this trip and on previous trips and other visits from the Secretary of Defense and visits we've seen in the past from Bill Burns and others, is really this fundamental belief that Washington still has, that this region revolves its foreign policy around Washington. And that simply is not true any longer. It may have been true 20 years ago. It may have been true 30 years ago, may even have been true 15 years ago. But over the last few years, we've seen a real reckoning of that, a broader independent foreign policy emerge from individual countries. Collectively as a region, there is a drive to look outwards. And the US's policies, particularly its military and security policies, have been found wanting either in the fact that the US hasn't served these countries with their national security interests in protecting them, particularly if we look at the last few years and the precarious fluctuation of relationships between the Arab Gulf countries, Iran and other spaces. And primarily, the US has not been seen as a country that is willing to really come forward and put its neck out and support the states that it has for decades committed to supporting, except for Israel. And since 1948, the instability in this region at its heart comes down to the illegal occupation of the Palestinian people. It always has done. And America has regularly, under all leadership, failed to come to terms with that. One would argue even the failure to enact what was agreed successfully at Oslo and other major inflection points in this broader conflict over the last 75 years. And now is no different. What President Biden, what Secretary of State Blinken have been attempting to do with regional leaders is to bring them onto the same page as the United States, which is to see this war as an existential crisis for Israel, to see the non-state actors in the region as behaving not in the national security interest or public interest of this region, which they may very well be doing. However, when the US sends its warships into the Mediterranean, creates these protection forces in the Red Sea, deploys its navy to these areas, it's not received by any of these actors or even the court of public opinion as protection or guardianship, as they like to call it. It's seen as provocation and antagonism. And what we're seeing is the non-state actor response to that.
Professor, I saw you raise your eyebrows at one point there. I couldn't tell whether you were in agreement or not, but do you want to come in?
Yeah, if I may, I want to make 2 brief points. The first point, the war in Gaza underscores that United States is by far the main foreign power with great influence, great capability to make peace or war. It is not Russia, it is not China, it is not European Union. Everybody comes to Washington when Secretary Blinken goes to the region. Everybody pays attention. It is United States. The second point is there is no doubt that United States has close ties to Israel, but also the conflict in Gaza highlights the failure of Arab countries to lobby United States. United States has very close ties to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to UAE, to Egypt, to almost all countries in the region. They have not been able to convince the administration, the Congress, the American public to take even-handed, balanced approach to the conflict. And Arab countries have to use the leverage they have to lobby in more effective way the American people, the administration, and the Congress.
Trita, you recently wrote at thenation.com that President Biden refuses to pursue the most obvious way of de-escalating tensions and of avoiding American deaths. That's a ceasefire in Gaza. And you asked, is Israel going to drag the US into another ruinous regional war. Is it?
Well, we see today that the Israelis are increasingly inclined to expand the war into Lebanon. The Biden administration does oppose that. The Biden administration is skeptical. There's an article in Washington Post today about the intelligence assessment of the lack of feasibility for Israel to win such a conflict. And the Biden administration says that from the very outset, the Israelis had the intent. In fact, in the early stages of the war, they wanted to go into Lebanon right away, but the Biden administration thwarted that. It seems, however, that we're back to square one because the Israelis are trying to do this. The U.S. does oppose it. But the question is, will American opposition to this be coupled with real pressure, or will it continue to be what we have seen so far, which is that Blinken goes to the region and asks other countries to put pressure on Hezbollah, on the Houthis, on Iran, while the U.S. itself does not put any material pressure on Israel. That equation will not work in the long run. We have frankly been quite lucky so far that we haven't seen an escalation. And
Hafsa?
In regards to the point
sorry,
of the ceasefire, if you take a look at the activities of Iraqi militias, for instance, they attacked U.S. troops 6 times the day before the ceasefire. But as soon as the ceasefire broke out, the attacks from Iraqi militias went down to 0 for 6 days, not a single attack. Even the Houthis reduced their attacks. There was only 1 attack during that 6-day period that we can confidently attribute to the Houthis. It's very clear. The message from them is, just listen to what the Houthis themselves are saying, that they will cease their attacks if there is a ceasefire. And even though this seems to be the easiest ways to actually avoid an escalation, it's the one path that the Biden administration refuses to pursue, which goes back to my earlier point. There is a commitment by the Biden administration to the destruction of Hamas, which is part of the reason I think that we see the Biden administration refusing even measures that would avoid the escalation that Biden says that he wants to avoid.
Hafsa, we already know that Blinken secured a pledge from Turkey's President Erdogan to use his country's influence to prevent the conflict broadening further. But Erdogan, as we know, is a harsh critic of Washington's support for Israel's Gaza campaign. He's rebuffed US pressure to cut off suspected Hamas funding, which flows through Turkey, defending the group as legitimately elected liberators fighting for their land. How sincere do you think was his pledge to use his influence to prevent this spiraling? And what sort of reception is Blinken going to get when he lands in other regional capitals this week?
Well, I think the question really is, going back to Trita's point, is what kind of leverage can you put on these non-state actors, particularly when they have very clearly defined their red lines for engagement? And part of what the US is failing to acknowledge is this is not just about Israel's desire to expand this conflict. This is about how much longer will the United States let this war continue and effectively on the ground end the quest for Palestinian statehood, because that will throw us into a perpetual cycle of violence, insurgency, threats of violence and acts by these non-state groups in the region. That could become a perpetual cycle that never ends. And part of what is mind-boggling, if you give Washington the benefit of the doubt that it does not seek that end resolution, is, well, what does it seek? What does it seek to achieve in Gaza? What does it seek to achieve in this relationship with Israel? What is it seeking to protect effectively? Even for Israel, the broader relationships that the regional parties that are either normalized or peaceful allies or peaceful partners and neighbors of Israel, what kind of part of the relationship can be salvaged after all of this, beyond just looking at the pressure on groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq? I mean, their ideology is very clear. Their red lines in this conflict has been very clear. Their raison d'être for decades has been very clear. that's going to be very difficult to change. And, learned people have long said the response and the answer to quelling the power of these groups is to seek a two-state solution. Clearly, that is not what is being sought through this conflict, through this escalation of violence, through this bombardment by either Israel or Washington, the United States and European allies. What that then extends us to ask is, what about the effect on other countries, and what kind of reception does Blinken receive in other capitals? Well, what kind of reception has he received in capitals in the last 8 to 12 weeks? It certainly hasn't been very pleasant. It certainly hasn't been very welcoming. He's been publicly rebuked by the foreign ministers of Jordan, of Egypt. He was, embarrassed by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. All of this feeds into a broader court of public opinion, not just at a moment where anti-American sentiment has been very high and is certainly sky high. But whilst Americans may not be seeing as much of this conflict on their screens here in the region, we're consuming it still 24/7 as if it's October 8th. Yeah. The level of violence, you mentioned and you mentioned Hamza Dahdouh, who was killed this afternoon by an Israeli airstrike. I mean, this stuff is playing on our TV screens regularly. Arab social media is constant on this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're almost out of time. Professor, I'll give you the last word. Is this visit by Blinken to the region then anything more than cheap window dressing? I mean, is his diplomacy going to be able to do anything to ease the plight of those suffering in Gaza? Is it going to bring about a ceasefire? Is it going to be able to prevent this conflict from spiraling into a wider regional one?
No, absolutely. It is not window dressing. It is because it's very complicated. It takes time, and there is no guarantee that it will work, it succeed. It is the fourth visit of the secretary in just few months. And it is also important that Arab countries like Israel do not take orders from United States. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of them, and Turkey, all of them resisted American pressure. And I want to end on positive note. There is generation gap, generation change in United States. Young people in United States, all over American universities, are demonstrating against Israel. So it is very sad what is happening now. Many innocent people are dying, but in the long run, I believe there is change in American public opinion, and this will be reflected in American policy.
I'm afraid we must end the programme. Many thanks indeed to all of you for being with us today. Trita Parsi, Hafsa Halawa, and Gawdat Bahgat. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.